There is a force moving through your life right now. You cannot see it. You cannot hold it in your hands. And yet, from the moment you wake in the morning to the moment you close your eyes at night, it is shaping every decision you make, every impulse you follow, every choice you avoid. Most people live their entire lives without ever examining this force closely. They experience it as moods, as cravings, as restlessness or boredom, or the sudden, insistent urge to reach for something, a phone, a snack, a distraction, without ever knowing quite why. This force has a name. It is desire. And the relationship you have with your desires, whether you are their master or they are yours, will determine, more than almost anything else, the shape and direction of your life. Right now, pause for just a moment and ask yourself an honest question. Think about the last time you made a decision you later regretted. Perhaps you said something you didn't mean in a moment of anger. Perhaps you reached for a second drink when you told yourself you wouldn't. Perhaps you spent an hour, or 2, or 3, scrolling through something that gave you nothing of real value, while the things that truly mattered to you, the work you wanted to do, the person you wanted to become, quietly waited in the corner. Ask yourself in that moment, who was making the decision? Was it the thoughtful, clear-eyed version of you, the one with a sense of direction and purpose? Or was it something older, more reflexive, more automatic? The truth is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Most of us are not nearly as deliberate as we believe we are. This is not a moral failing. This is not weakness. It is, in fact, the condition of being human, the same ancient systems that kept your ancestors alive, that fired urgent signals of hunger, fear, longing, and pleasure, are still operating inside you today. They have not evolved to distinguish between a genuine threat and an inconvenient email, between real hunger and the habit of stress, eating, between authentic joy and the brief, hollow buzz of digital distraction. These systems are fast, they are powerful, and they were built to react, not to reflect. The question at the heart of this book is deceptively simply, can you learn to respond instead of just react? Can you learn to understand your desires well enough that they no longer make your choices for you? The answer is yes, and the path to that yes is what we are about to walk together. Let us be clear about something from the very beginning, because this point matters enormously. Desire is not the enemy. Desire is, in many ways, the engine of human life. Without desire, there is no ambition, no love, no creation, no growth. The person who has killed all desire has not achieved freedom. They have achieved a kind of emptiness. The goal of self-mastery is never to become a machine, cold and untouched by the texture of life. The goal is something far richer and far more demanding than that. The goal is awareness. The goal is the ability to look at a desire, any desire, and make a conscious, intentional choice about whether to follow it, to delay it, to redirect it, or to release it. Not out of shame, not out of self-punishment, but out of the deep recognition that you have values, you have a direction, and you are the one who gets to decide whether your desires serve that direction or undermine it. There is a word for the person who achieves this. It is not perfect. It is not saint. It is not someone without flaws or struggles or moments of weakness. The word is free, because when you are no longer at the mercy of every craving, every impulse, every reflexive need for comfort or stimulation or validation, you discover something remarkable. You can choose. Really choose. Not from habit, not from fear, not from the pull of the moment, but from the stillness of a person who knows their own mind. That kind of freedom is worth more than any temporary pleasure you might sacrifice to achieve it. And it begins, as all profound things begin, with understanding. So let us begin. Let us start at the very foundation, with the nature of desire itself, with why it exists, how it works, and why human beings, in every culture, in every era, have wrestled with its power. Because you are not alone in this struggle. You have never been alone. The philosophers of ancient Greece spoke of it. The wisdom traditions of every civilization have grappled with it. And the science of the modern age has given us tools to understand it at a level that our ancestors could never have imagined. What you are about to learn is ancient and new at once. It is deeply personal and, at the same time, profoundly universal. And at the end of this journey, you will not be perfect, but you will be something better than perfect. You will be aware. You will be intentional. You will be, in the truest sense of the word, free. Let us begin. To understand the power of desire, you must first understand the creature who experiences it. You must understand, in the broadest sense, what it means to be human, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a biological reality, because your desires do not emerge from nothing. They have a history, they have a purpose, and that purpose, at its core, has almost nothing to do with your happiness or your long-term success. It has everything to do with your survival. Cast your mind back, not decades, but tens of thousands of years. Imagine a world without grocery stores, without central heating, without the 10,000 safety nets and comforts that the modern age has constructed around us. Imagine living in small groups, exposed to the elements, in a world where food was scarce and danger was constant. In that world, the desires that kept you alive were not luxuries. They were necessities. The desire for food drove you to search and hunt and gather. The desire for warmth drove you to build and seek shelter. The desire for connection, for the company of your group, was not a sentimental preference. It was survival. Humans who were cast out from their communities did not usually last long. And the desire for pleasure, for the things that felt good and rewarding, was the brain's elegant mechanism for ensuring that you repeated the behaviors that kept you alive and reproducing. These desires were not weaknesses. They were profound, sophisticated, life-sustaining forces. And the brain that housed them developed an extraordinary system to make sure you paid attention to them. That system is built around a molecule you have almost certainly heard of: dopamine. Dopamine is one of the brain's primary neurotransmitters, a chemical messenger that travels between neurons, shaping how you feel, how you think, and above all, what you want. For decades, dopamine was understood primarily as the brain's pleasure chemical, the thing released when you eat something delicious, when you achieve something significant, when you experience something wonderful. And that is part of the story. But the fuller picture is far more interesting and far more relevant to the challenge of self-mastery. Modern neuroscience has revealed that dopamine is not simply a pleasure signal. It is, more precisely, an anticipation signal. It is the chemical of wanting. Dopamine surges not just when you receive a reward, but when your brain predicts that a reward is coming. It is the rise of craving before you have even touched the thing you crave. It is the electric anticipation of opening a notification, the restless hunger of knowing there is food in the kitchen, the powerful pull of a desire not yet satisfied. This is a crucial distinction because it explains something that many people find deeply puzzling about their own behavior. Why so many things that they pursue feel less satisfying than anticipated once they actually arrive? You have experienced this. You wanted something, perhaps an object, perhaps an experience, perhaps a moment of recognition, and you wanted it with an intensity that felt almost unbearable. And then you had it, and the feeling was fine, perhaps pleasant, but nowhere near as powerful as the wanting had been. And then, almost immediately, you found yourself wanting something else. This is not a malfunction. This is the system working exactly as it was designed. Dopamine does not say this thing will make you happy. Dopamine says this thing might be rewarding. Pursue it. And once you have it, the dopamine system recalibrates, scanning the horizon for the next potential reward. Pulling your attention forward once more. Understanding this is not discouraging. It is, in fact, deeply freeing. Because it means that the relentless hunger for more that so many people experience, the sense that satisfaction is always just one achievement, one purchase, one experience away, is not a personal failing. It is a biological feature. The brain that was built to help your ancestors survive was also built to keep them perpetually hungry, perpetually searching, perpetually reaching forward. That was adaptive in a world of scarcity. In a world of abundance, it can become a trap. Because the world you live in today has been designed, with extraordinary precision, to exploit this ancient hunger. Every notification is an engineered dopamine trigger. Every algorithm is built on the principle of variable reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive. Every carefully crafted advertisement is built around the art of manufacturing desire, creating a felt sense of lack, and then offering a product as the cure. The entire digital economy has been constructed at enormous cost and with extraordinary sophistication around the simple insight that if you can trigger a person's reward system, you can direct their behavior. This is not a conspiracy. This is simply the consequence of applying modern neuroscience to commerce. But the effect on the person living inside this environment is profound. Because when the world is constantly stimulating your desire system, when your phone buzzes with notifications, when social media curates an infinite scroll of novelty, when food has been engineered to be maximally stimulating, when entertainment is designed to be endlessly compelling, the ordinary, quiet moments of real life can start to feel flat by comparison. Waiting feels unbearable. Silence feels threatening. The capacity to sit with discomfort, which is one of the most important human skills, begins to atrophy, and the gap between the stimulated version of yourself, reactive, craving, impulsive, and the intentional version of yourself, reflective, patient, purposeful, begins to widen. This is where the concept of self-mastery becomes not just appealing but urgent. Not because pleasure is wrong, not because desire is shameful, but because a life entirely at the mercy of a biological reward system that was built for a world that no longer exists, in a commercial environment specifically designed to exploit it, is not freedom. It is a very comfortable, very stimulating, very distracting form of captivity. The philosophers understood this long before neuroscience could prove it. In ancient Greece, the Stoics spoke of what they called the passions, powerful emotional drives that, if left ungoverned, could overwhelm reason and lead a person away from their highest nature. They did not say that passion was evil. They said that passion, unexamined and unguided, was dangerous. Epictetus, who was born a slave and became one of the great teachers of his age, distinguished between what is up to us our judgments, our intentions, our responses, and what is not. He understood that freedom was not found in the absence of constraints, but in the mastery of the one thing, that no external force could ever fully control the mind. In the Buddhist tradition, the recognition of craving as a source of suffering is one of the foundational insights. Not because pleasure is to be avoided, but because the compulsive pursuit of pleasure, the inability to be present with what is without constantly reaching for something else, is itself a form of pain. The Stoics and the Buddhists arrived, from entirely different directions, at remarkably similar conclusions about the human condition. And then there is Aristotle, who spoke of eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but more accurately understood as flourishing or living well. For Aristotle, the good life was not a life of maximum pleasure. It was a life of virtue, of excellence, of living in accordance with your highest capacities. And that kind of life required something he called sophrosin, the capacity for self-regulation, for knowing when to act and when to refrain, for being the master of your own impulses rather than their servant. These are ancient ideas, but they are not outdated ones. They point toward a truth about human nature that has not changed and will not change because it is rooted in what we are. We are creatures of desire, and we are creatures of reason. The tension between those two aspects of our nature is not a problem to be solved. It is the defining challenge of being human, and the way you navigate that tension, the degree to which you cultivate your capacity for intentional choice over reflexive reaction, will shape the arc of your life more profoundly than talent, more profoundly than circumstance, and perhaps more profoundly than anything else. There is one more concept from our evolutionary history that deserves attention here, and it is the concept of the tribal social environment. Human beings did not evolve as isolated individuals. They evolved as deeply social creatures whose survival depended on the group. And in that group environment, certain social desires became just as powerful and just as urgent as the physical ones. The desire for status, for respect, for recognition, for a valued place within the community, was not mere vanity, it was survival. Low-status individuals in ancient social groups had less access to resources, less protection, and less reproductive opportunity. The brain therefore evolved to monitor social standing with extraordinary sensitivity and to generate powerful motivational states in response to social threat or social opportunity. The desire for validation, the hunger to be seen and acknowledged, is the modern echo of those ancient survival circuits. The dopamine hit that comes from a like on a social media post is not fundamentally different from the reward signal that once came from being praised by your tribal elder. The anxiety of social rejection is not weakness. It is an ancient alarm system firing in response to a perceived threat to belonging. Understanding this does not make these drives less powerful, but it does change your relationship to them. When you see the biological machinery behind the feeling, when you recognize that the craving for validation is an ancient drive, not an eternal truth, you create space between the feeling and the response. You gain, in that space, the possibility of choice. And choice, as we will discover throughout this journey, is everything. Now let us go deeper into the world of impulse. Let us look, with patience and without judgment, at the mechanism by which a desire becomes an action. The chain of events that runs from the flicker of craving to the moment you pick up your phone, reach for the snack, snap at someone you love, or abandon the difficult work you promised yourself you would do. Because that chain, once understood, can be interrupted, and once it can be interrupted, it can be redirected. And once it can be redirected, you begin to understand what it means to be truly free. The first thing to understand about impulses is that they are, by design, fast. The brain regions responsible for generating automatic, habitual, and instinctive responses are older, deeper, and in many situations faster than the regions responsible for deliberate thought. The amygdala, which plays a central role in processing emotional stimuli and generating fear and desire responses, can trigger a behavioral reaction before the prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, judgment, and self-control, has even fully registered what is happening. By the time you are consciously aware that you want something, the wanting has often already begun to shape your behavior. This is why willpower, in the conventional sense, is such an unreliable tool. We tend to think of willpower as a kind of mental muscle that can simply overpower a desire, a brute force of the mind that can say no firmly enough, loudly enough, for long enough to keep impulse at bay. And willpower does exist, it does matter, but it has serious limitations, and the greatest limitation is this: it is always fighting uphill. When you are trying to resist an impulse by force of will, you are pitting the slow, effortful, conscious part of your brain against the fast, automatic, emotionally powerful part. And that is a battle you will sometimes win and sometimes lose, and that will exhaust you regardless. Research in psychology, particularly work built on the concept of ego depletion, has demonstrated that the capacity for self-regulation is not infinite. It draws on a shared resource, mental energy, attention, deliberate effort, and that resource can be depleted. The person who has spent the morning resisting distraction, managing difficult emotions, and making careful decisions may find by afternoon that their resistance to unhealthy food, or late-night scrolling, or unnecessary spending is significantly lower. Not because they are weak, because they are human. The insight here is not that willpower is useless. It is that willpower alone is an insufficient strategy, and any approach to self-mastery that relies primarily on gritting your teeth and bearing it will eventually break down, usually at exactly the moment you need it most. So what actually works? This is where we turn to the science of habits, because habits are, in a very real sense, the architecture of everyday behavior. A habit is a behavioral sequence that has been repeated often enough that it has become largely automatic, triggered by a cue, executed through a routine, and reinforced by a reward. The cue might be a particular time of day, an emotional state, a physical sensation, or an environmental trigger. The routine is the behavior itself, and the reward is the signal that tells the brain this worked. Remember this, do it again. The neurologist and habit researcher, Anne Graybiel, and her colleagues at MIT have demonstrated through decades of research that habit formation involves a process in the brain called chunking. The way the brain packages a sequence of individual actions into a single automatic unit, stored in the basal ganglia, which can then be triggered and executed with minimal conscious effort. This is why habits are so persistent. They are not stored in the deliberate, effortful parts of the brain that are vulnerable to fatigue and distraction. They are stored in deep, reliable, automatic systems that run in the background of consciousness. This is a gift and a challenge simultaneously. It is a gift because habits allow you to do complex things. Drive a car, type on a keyboard, navigate familiar routes. without burning precious mental resources. But it is a challenge because the same mechanism that helps you execute good habits also perpetuates destructive ones. Every time you reach for your phone the moment you feel bored, or eat in response to stress, or retreat into distraction when difficult emotions arise, you are strengthening the neural pathway of that habitual response. You are carving a little deeper into the groove. And the next time the cue appears, the pull toward that behavior will be just a little bit stronger. This is why changing behavior can feel so difficult. You are not just deciding something different. You are trying to reroute deeply etched neural pathways. And the brain, which is an efficiency-seeking system, resists that effort with everything it has. But here is what the research also shows: habits can be changed. Not easily, and not by force alone, but they can be changed. And the key is not primarily to fight the habit at the moment of the cue. The key is to understand the loop and intervene at the right point. The most effective approach, as described in the work of researchers like Charles Duhigg and Wendy Wood, is to keep the cue and the reward, but change the routine. To identify what you are actually seeking, the underlying reward, and find a different, more constructive behavior that delivers something similar. The person who reaches for their phone when they feel bored may not really be seeking stimulation. They may be seeking relief from a feeling of purposelessness, or a sense of connection, or simply a moment of mental ease. Once you understand what the reward actually is, you open the possibility of satisfying that need in a different way. A way that aligns with your values and your long-term goals rather than undermining them. There is another dimension to the psychology of impulse that is essential to understand: the role of emotional states. Most of us underestimate how dramatically our emotions influence our decisions and our relationship to our desires. Research in decision making has consistently shown that emotional state has a profound effect on the kinds of choices people make. In states of stress, anxiety, or negative emotion, the brain tends to favor short-term rewards over long-term ones. The technical term for this is present bias, the tendency to place disproportionate weight on the immediate moment relative to the future. When you are stressed, the future feels further away. The immediate discomfort feels more urgent, and the promise of relief, however temporary, feels more compelling than it would in a calmer state. This is why so many habitual behaviors are tied to stress: overeating, excessive drinking, compulsive scrolling, aggressive behavior. These are rarely the behaviors of a person who is calm and well-resourced. They are the behaviors of a person in a state of emotional overwhelm, trying to manage an internal state that feels too difficult to bear. And the habitual behavior, whatever it is, provides temporary relief. It does not solve the problem. It often makes the problem worse over time. But in the moment, it works just well enough to be reinforcing. Understanding this pattern, the emotional trigger, the impulsive behavior, the temporary relief, the long-term cost, is not about assigning blame. It is about illuminating the mechanism so that you can see it clearly. Because the moment you can see a mechanism clearly, you gain the ability to interrupt it. Not perfectly, not always, but gradually, consistently, meaningfully. There is also the dimension of what psychologists call temporal discounting, the way the brain naturally treats future rewards as less valuable than immediate ones. If someone offers you $10 today or $15 in a month, many people will take the $10 now, even though waiting would be more rational. The future reward is discounted by the brain's impatience. And the more emotionally aroused you are, the more extreme this discounting becomes. The pull of the present moment grows stronger precisely when you are least equipped to resist it. But here is what is remarkable. This tendency, like so many aspects of our psychology, is not fixed. Research has shown that people can learn to reduce temporal discounting, to experience the future more vividly, to give it more weight in their present decision-making. Techniques like future self-visualization, actively imagining in detail the person you will be in 5 years or 10 years, and asking how the choice you are making right now affects that person, can measurably shift decision-making toward greater patience and long-term thinking. Strategies like pre-commitment, making the future choice now, before the moment of impulse arrives, can short-circuit the process of temptation altogether. These are not tricks. They are applications of a deeper understanding of the brain's architecture. They work with the grain of human psychology rather than against it. And they are the foundation of what we might call intelligent self-mastery, not the brute force approach of suppression, but the sophisticated approach of understanding, designing, and redirecting. Now let us also speak honestly about one of the most powerful forces in the psychology of desire, the role of identity, because perhaps the most important insight in all of behavioral science is this: behavior follows identity, what you believe about yourself. At the deepest level, the stories you tell about who you are and what kind of person you are shapes your behavior more powerfully than any goal, any resolution, or any strategy. If you believe, at your core, that you are someone who lacks discipline, every attempt to exercise discipline will feel like a performance, a costume you are wearing that does not quite fit. And when the moment of pressure comes, you will tend to revert to the self you actually believe in. On the other hand, if you have built, through repeated small choices, a genuine internal identity as someone who is thoughtful and self-aware, someone who makes conscious choices rather than reflexive ones, then in the moment of temptation, that identity becomes a resource. You are not fighting desire from outside. You are responding from within, as a person who has already decided what they stand for. This is why the process of building self-mastery is not primarily a process of restraint. It is a process of construction. You are building something. You are building a self. And every small, conscious choice you make, every moment you pause instead of react, every time you choose the more demanding option, every time you act in accordance with your values instead of your impulses, is a brick in that construction. Over time, those bricks become a building, and that building is the foundation from which all genuine freedom flows. There is a story I want to tell you. The name is invented, but the life is not. You have met this person. You may have been this person. Perhaps in some part of yourself, you recognize yourself in this story right now. His name was Marcus. He was 32 years old, lived in a mid-sized city, and had what most people would describe as a perfectly ordinary life. A decent job in data analysis, a small apartment, a group of friends he saw occasionally, and a quiet, persistent sense that none of it was quite what he had imagined for himself at 22. Not miserable, not broken, just drifting, just slightly, indefinitely, off course. The gap between where Marcus was and where he wanted to be was not large, in the external sense. He was not in crisis. He had not made any single dramatic mistake that had derailed him. He had simply, year after year, chosen the comfortable thing over the challenging one, the immediate pleasure over the deferred reward, the easy habit over the effortful growth, and the accumulation of those choices, each one small and seemingly insignificant, each one rationalized with enough logic to feel reasonable in the moment, had, over time, created a life that felt smaller than he was. He wanted to be fit. He had been wanting to be fit for about 6 years. Every January, or every few months, when a particular discomfort became acute enough, he would resolve to start. And he would start. He would wake up Monday morning with the clean, bright feeling of new beginning. He would exercise, and it would hurt, but it would also feel good. The kind of virtue, tinged satisfaction of someone who believes they are finally becoming who they want to be. He would eat well that day. He would sleep at a reasonable hour, and he would feel, for a brief window, as though the version of himself he had always imagined was actually possible. By Wednesday, something would shift. The newness had worn off. The soreness from Monday's workout had arrived. The day at work had been difficult in a way that depleted his reserves. And at 7 in the evening, sitting on his couch with his phone in his hand and the familiar blue glow of streaming television washing over him, the idea of getting up and going for a run felt not just unappealing, but genuinely unreasonable. He had worked hard. He was tired. He deserved to rest. He would go tomorrow. He did not go tomorrow. He went, perhaps, the following Monday, and the pattern would begin again. Marcus was not lazy. That is important to understand. He was intelligent, capable, and deeply well-intentioned. But his relationship with his own desires had never been examined. He had never sat with the question of why the pull of the couch was so much more powerful than the pull of the future he said he wanted. He had never looked honestly at the mechanism of his own avoidance. The way stress at work triggered an emotional state that narrowed his decision, making toward immediate comfort. The way his apartment had become an environment perfectly engineered to support passivity, the way his identity, the story he told himself about who he was, included, somewhere near the bottom, a quiet conviction that he was not really the kind of person who followed through. His relationship with his phone was similar. He had read enough to know that excessive screen time was a problem. He genuinely believed this. He could articulate the research. He could describe, with some precision, the way dopamine loops in social media worked. And yet his average daily screen time was 4.5 hours. He knew this because his phone told him, with bland, implacable honesty, every Sunday morning. He would look at the number, feel a flash of something between guilt and resolution, and then open the same apps that had consumed those hours and begin again. It was not hypocrisy, precisely. It was the natural result of having knowledge without integration, awareness without application. He knew the map, but had not yet walked the territory. There were other things. His diet was a running negotiation between his values and his appetites, with his appetites winning most evenings. He had started an online course in Python programming, something that genuinely interested him, and had watched the first 4 modules with real engagement, before drifting away in the 5th week and never returning. The course tab sat open in his browser for months, like a small reproach. He had a list of books he wanted to read. He had bought most of them. Several were still in their packaging. Marcus was not alone in any of this. He was, in fact, entirely representative of a particular kind of modern struggle, the struggle of the intelligent, somewhat self-aware person who knows what they want knows in general terms what it would take to get there, and yet finds themselves, day after day, caught in the gap between intention and action, between the person they see when they imagine their best self and the person they actually are at 9:30 in the evening when everything is available and nothing is urgent. The turning point, and there was one, eventually, though it came not with thunder, but with a kind of quiet, sustained recognition, began one winter evening when Marcus was reading an article about behavioral change. He was reading it on his phone in bed at midnight. The irony was not lost on him, but something in the article reached him in a way that others had not, because it did not speak about willpower or discipline or motivation. It spoke about understanding. It spoke about the relationship between awareness and freedom. The article described a simple exercise for 1 week. Before acting on any significant impulse, pause for 60 seconds. Do not resist the impulse. Do not fight it, simply observe it. Name what you are feeling. Notice where the impulse is coming from. Notice what you are trying to get. Marcus tried this the next day, not with great conviction, but with genuine curiosity. The first time the urge to reach for his phone arose, it happened within 40 minutes of waking. He stopped. He sat with the feeling. And what he discovered, to his considerable surprise, was that the urge was not really about anything on the phone. It was about the subtle anxiety of the morning, the low, grey dread of an empty, unstructured hour. The phone was not what he wanted. What he wanted was to fill a kind of internal silence that felt uncomfortable. The phone was just the tool closest to hand. This was a small discovery, but it was a genuinely significant one, because once Marcus could see the mechanism lost a little of its power. Not all of it. The phone was still there, and the habit was still strong, and the morning anxiety was still real. But the automatic quality of the behavior had been interrupted. There was now a hairline crack between the impulse and the action. And in that crack, something new could grow. What Marcus was beginning to learn, slowly, imperfectly, with many false starts, was the first and most fundamental skill of self. Mastery, the skill of observation. The ability to look at your own interior life without flinching, without judgment, and without immediately trying to fix or change what you see. Just to see it clearly, just to know what is actually happening inside you, as distinct from the story you have been telling yourself about what is happening. Over the months that followed, Marcus's life did not transform dramatically. There was no sudden awakening, no overnight revolution, but there was a gradual, accumulating shift. He began to understand his own patterns with a precision he had never possessed before. He began to see the emotional triggers that preceded his most self-defeating behaviors. He began to notice, with a kind of detached curiosity, the way his environment was structured to support passivity, and he began, slowly, to restructure it. He moved the phone to another room at night. He joined a gym class that met at the same time each week and required advance booking because he understood, by now, that structure and commitment reduced the friction of the moment of decision. He did not pretend the discomfort of growth away. He learned to expect it, and then he learned to do the hard thing anyway. He was not perfect. He never would be. But he was no longer drifting. He was, for the first time, choosing. And that made everything different. There is an experiment that has become one of the most famous in all of psychology, and it begins with children, marshmallows, and a promise. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a researcher named Walter Mischel at Stanford University conducted a series of studies with young children. Each child was brought into a room and offered a single marshmallow. The researcher explained that they needed to leave for a few minutes, and that if the child could wait, if they could resist eating the marshmallow until the researcher returned, they would be rewarded with a second marshmallow. But if they ate the first marshmallow before the researcher came back, they would not receive a second one. Then the researcher left, and the children were alone with their marshmallow, and the camera was running. The footage is both amusing and deeply illuminating. Some children ate the marshmallow almost immediately. Others stared at it, poked it, sniffed it, covered their eyes, sang to themselves, turned away from it, engaged in elaborate self-distraction, and managed to wait. And the difference between these two groups of children, Michel and his colleagues found in follow-up studies conducted years later, was associated with a remarkable range of outcomes in life. The children who had been able to wait, who had exercised what researchers call delay of gratification, went on to show higher academic achievement, better social adjustment, lower rates of substance use, greater self-efficacy, and higher measures of what we loosely call success. By almost every metric studied, the marshmallow test became famous, and it was also contested. Later researchers raised important questions about the role of socioeconomic factors and family stability in determining whether the researcher's promise of a second marshmallow are valid, and nuances to be careful about simple interpretations of complex finding. But the core insight of the research, that the ability to delay immediate gratification in service of longer-term goals is a profoundly important skill that shapes life outcomes, has been supported by decades of subsequent research across many cultures and contexts. The basic truth holds. Why does the ability to delay gratification matter so much? The answer is not simply that patience is virtuous in some abstract moral sense. The answer lies in the fundamental architecture of achievement and fulfillment. Almost everything worth having in life requires a gap, a span of time and effort between the decision to pursue something and the arrival of the reward. The person who wants physical health must endure workouts that are uncomfortable before the body adapts. The person who wants mastery in any domain must pass through the long, humbling apprenticeship of incompetence before skill is achieved. The person who wants a deep and lasting relationship must invest patience, vulnerability, and sustained attention before the roots of real intimacy can form. The person who wants financial security must repeatedly choose the deferred purchase, the saved dollar, the patient investment over the immediate gratification of spending. In every case, the immediate experience involves some form of discomfort or sacrifice, and the reward is real but postponed. And for a brain wired to prefer the immediate over the future, this gap is genuinely difficult to navigate. But here is what makes it not just difficult, but beautiful. Every time you successfully navigate that gap, every time you hold the discomfort of the present for the sake of what you genuinely value, you are not just getting closer to the goal. You are building something inside yourself. You are training a capacity. You are adding to the foundation of self-trust and self-efficacy that will make every future challenge slightly more navigable. The philosophers who spoke of virtue as a practice, not a state you arrive at, but an activity you engage in over and over, in the choices and challenges of ordinary life, were describing this same process. Aristotle wrote that we become what we repeatedly do. We become courageous by doing courageous things, even when we are afraid. We become disciplined by making disciplined choices, even when part of us wants to choose otherwise. The virtue is not the final achievement. The virtue is the practice. It is the ongoing, imperfect, magnificent effort of becoming. There is something else worth understanding about delayed gratification, and it is perhaps the most important point of all. The person who can delay gratification is not denying themselves pleasure. They are cultivating a richer, deeper, more durable form of it. The pleasure of eating well is genuinely smaller in any single moment than the pleasure of eating whatever you want whenever you want it. But the accumulated experience of someone who has maintained their health over years, the energy, the vitality, the freedom from certain kinds of suffering, is an experience of pleasure that the person who never exercises self-control never fully knows. The pleasure of the skilled musician is deeper than the pleasure of the person who quit practicing because it was difficult. The pleasure of genuine intimacy is richer than the pleasure of constant novelty. The pleasure of an achievement that required real sacrifice is of a fundamentally different quality than the pleasure of something easily obtained. There is a term in psychology for this eudaimonic well-being as distinguished from hedonic well-being. Hedonic well-being is the pleasure of the moment, the immediate, sensory, rewarding experience of having your desires satisfied. It is real and it matters. There is nothing wrong with it. But eudaimonic well-being is something deeper, the sense of meaning, growth, engagement, and authentic fulfillment that comes from living in accordance with your values and your highest capacities. Research consistently shows that it is eudaimonic well-being, not hedonic pleasure, that is most strongly associated with lasting happiness, health, and life satisfaction. The person who has learned to delay gratification, who has learned to hold the immediate desire in service of a larger purpose, is not sacrificing joy. They are learning to access a form of joy that the purely pleasure-seeking life never discovers. This is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want in every moment. That is not freedom. That is simply reactivity with a positive spin. Real freedom is the freedom to choose what you value and to organize your behavior around that choice, consistently enough that your life begins to take the shape of your deepest intentions. Real freedom is the capacity to say not now and mean it, and feel in that small act of discipline, not deprivation but power. We have spoken about the mechanisms of desire. We have spoken about habits and impulse, and the psychology of instant gratification. We have spoken about the science of delayed reward and the philosophy of becoming. But all of this understanding, as rich and as illuminating as it is, remains theoretical until it meets the real, lived, messy territory of emotional life. Because the desires we struggle with are not merely cognitive puzzles. They are emotional realities. They arise from states of feeling, from anxiety, from loneliness, from boredom, from grief, from the many and varied textures of human pain and incompleteness. And no strategy for self-mastery can succeed without an honest reckoning with the emotional world. The key to emotional self-regulation, the foundation beneath all the strategies and techniques and cognitive frameworks, is the deceptively simple capacity for awareness. Not just knowing that emotions exist, but being able to observe them as they arise, in real time, with something approaching equanimity, to be a witness to your own internal experience, rather than simply being inside it. swept along by its currents without the ability to see where you are. This distinction between being in an emotion and observing an emotion is one of the most consequential in all of psychology. When you are in an emotion, it fills your entire perceptual field. The emotion is not something you are having. The emotion is, for that moment, what you are. Anger does not feel like a transient state that will pass. It feels like truth, like clear perception of reality, like justified response. Fear does not feel like a fear response. It feels like accurate assessment of genuine danger. And desire, urgent, compelling desire, does not feel like a neurochemical event in the reward system of your brain. It feels like need. It feels like what you should do, right now, without delay. But when you can observe the emotion, even slightly, even imperfectly, something profound shifts. The emotion becomes an event that is happening to you, rather than the totality of what you are. You can look at the anger and recognize it as anger, which means you can also recognize that it will pass, that its perceptions are colored by its state, that the action it is urging is probably not the most considered one. You can look at the desire and recognize it as desire, which means you can also recognize that it is not a command, that you have a choice, that there are other things you value beyond the satisfaction of this particular craving in this particular moment. This observational capacity, which psychologists call metacognition, or thinking about thinking, is not available to everyone at all times. It is a skill, and like all skills, it is cultivated by practice. The most well-established practice for developing it is mindfulness meditation, which in its simplest form involves sitting quietly, directing attention to the breath, noticing when the mind wanders, as it invariably does, and gently returning attention to the breath without judgment. This seems, when described, almost absurdly simple. It seems too simple to matter, but the research on its effects is both extensive and striking. Regular mindfulness practice has been shown to reduce activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, and to increase the functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional processing regions, which is another way of saying it strengthens the neural infrastructure of self-regulation. But you do not need to meditate in a formal sense to develop observational awareness. You can cultivate it in the ordinary moments of your life. When you notice an impulse arising, the desire to check your phone, to eat when you are not hungry, to avoid a task you find difficult, you can practice pausing for just a moment and asking, what am I actually feeling right now? Not what am I doing, not what do I want, but what am I feeling? What is the emotional texture of this moment? What state has triggered this impulse? This simple inquiry, practiced consistently, gently without pressure, gradually develops an internal observer, a small but significant part of you that learns to watch the emotional weather without being entirely controlled by it. And the more you practice this, the more this observer becomes a genuine resource in moments of difficulty. It becomes, in time, a kind of internal calm, not the calm of someone who is cut off from feeling, but the calm of someone who can feel fully without being driven by what they feel. There is also the question of what we do with difficult emotions once we have acknowledged them. Because awareness alone, while essential, is not sufficient. The person who sees clearly that they are in a state of anxiety and still has no idea what to do with the anxiety has advanced, but has not yet arrived. The second skill, after awareness, is what we might call regulation. the ability to work with emotional states, rather than being worked on by them. Emotional regulation does not mean emotional suppression. Research in affective science consistently shows that attempting to suppress an emotion, to push it down, to pretend it is not there, to refuse to acknowledge it, is not only ineffective, but often counterproductive. Suppression tends to amplify the emotional experience internally while reducing its external expression, leaving the person more flooded and more depleted than if they had simply acknowledged the feeling. What works is not suppression, but what is sometimes called reappraisal, the ability to reframe the meaning of a situation in a way that changes the emotional response it generates. Reappraisal is not denial. It is not positive thinking in the shallow sense of pretending everything is fine. It is the genuine, thoughtful work of examining the story you are telling yourself about a situation and asking whether that story is accurate, whether there are other ways of understanding what is happening, and whether the emotional response that story is generating is actually serving you. The person who interprets a setback as evidence of their own permanent inadequacy will generate an emotional response very different from the person who interprets the same setback as information, as feedback that points toward what needs to change. The facts may be identical. The internal experience will be profoundly different. This is not easy work. It requires honesty and courage. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it. It requires a kind of inner resilience, an understanding that difficult feelings are not catastrophes, but simply weather, temporary and survivable and, in many cases, deeply informative. But it is work that anyone can do. It is not the province of any particular temperament or any special gift. It is a practice, and like all practices, it yields its rewards to those who engage in it with patience and with consistency. Before we arrive at the question of values, there is one more layer of emotional intelligence worth exploring: the understanding of what psychologists sometimes call secondary emotions. A secondary emotion is the feeling you have about the feeling. You feel anxious, and then you feel ashamed of feeling anxious. You feel angry, and then you feel guilty for being angry. You feel sad, and then you feel frustrated with yourself for not being stronger. This layering, the emotion about the emotion, is extraordinarily common, extraordinarily exhausting, and extraordinarily counterproductive. Because when you are ashamed of your anxiety, you are not simply anxious. You are anxious and ashamed, which is a heavier and more paralyzing combination. The shame does not reduce the anxiety. It amplifies it, because now the anxiety has become a signal, not just about whatever originally triggered it, but about your own inadequacy for feeling it. The spiral deepens, and the behavioral response to this compound emotional state is typically more avoidant, more self-defeating, and more difficult to interrupt than the response to the original, simpler feeling would have been. The antidote to secondary emotion is something that sounds simple but requires genuine practice: self-compassion, not self-pity. Not the lowering of standards, not the excuse of perpetual emotional fragility, but the basic, kind recognition that you are a human being who experiences difficult emotions, and that experiencing difficult emotions is neither shameful nor exceptional. It is, in fact, universal. Every person who has ever lived has felt anxiety, anger, sadness, and desire. Every person who has ever lived has acted from those states in ways they later regretted. The emotion is not the failure. The inability to see the emotion clearly and to respond to it with something other than the automatic habitual reaction, is the only place where genuine growth is available. Researcher Kristin Neff, who has studied self-compassion extensively, describes it as having three components: mindful awareness of difficult feelings without over-identifying with them, recognition of common humanity, the understanding that suffering and struggle are not unique to you, but shared by all human beings, and self-kindness, the ability to treat yourself in moments of difficulty with the same warmth and care that you would offer a good friend in the same situation. These three components together create an internal environment in which genuine learning from difficult experience becomes possible. Not the defense of self-criticism, not the retreat of self-pity, but the honest, grounded, forward-looking orientation of someone who can see what happened clearly and ask, from a place of stability rather than despair, what can be learned? There is one more aspect of emotional self-awareness that deserves particular attention, and it is the awareness of values. Because one of the most powerful tools for navigating moments of temptation is not a technique at all. It is a relationship with what you genuinely care about. Research has shown that people who have a clear, articulated sense of their own values are significantly more likely to make choices that align with those values, even under pressure, than people who have a vague or unexamined sense of what they stand for. This is sometimes called values clarification, and it is as simple and as profound as it sounds: the practice of sitting down in quiet and asking yourself the questions that most people postpone indefinitely. What do I actually want from my life? Not what do I think I should want. Not what I have been conditioned to want. Not what would impress others. But what do I actually, genuinely, at my core care about? What kind of person do I want to be? What would I want to have done with my time here? When I look back from the far end of my life, these are not easy questions. They are not questions with quick answers, but they are the questions that, when taken seriously, create a compass. And when you have a compass, the moment of temptation looks different. Instead of a conflict between what you want now and what you should want, it becomes a question of which version of what you want is more authentically you. And that question, honestly asked, often has an answer that is both clear and surprisingly available. We have been speaking of awareness, of emotional regulation, of understanding the architecture of habit and impulse. Now let us speak of building, because self-mastery is not only a matter of insight, it is also a matter of construction, the slow, patient, day-by-day work of building a self that increasingly reflects your highest intentions. And the foundation of that construction is composed of something perhaps more humble than insight. It is composed of small victories. There is a principle that has been described in various ways by psychologists, philosophers, and coaches across many disciplines, and it goes something like this: the way you do anything is the way you do everything. This is not literally true. Human beings are far too complex and context-dependent for any single aphorism to capture them fully. But it points toward something important. There is a coherence to character that runs across contexts. The person who keeps small promises to themselves tends to be the person who keeps large ones. The person who maintains discipline in the small, unobserved moments of daily life tends to be more reliable in the large, visible, high-stakes moments, and conversely, the person who regularly abandons their stated commitments when they become inconvenient tends to do so across multiple areas of life. This is because character is not a collection of separate modules, each operating independently in its designated domain. Character is a practice, and like any practice, it has a momentum, a direction that is shaped by the cumulative weight of repeated choices. Every time you do what you said you would do, even when it is difficult, even when no one is watching, even when it is a small thing, you are casting a vote for a particular version of yourself. You are building, incrementally and irrevocably, the self that you will one day simply be, without effort, because it has become what you are. James Clear, in his work on habits and behavior change, describes this as the accumulation of votes for an identity. Every action is a small piece of evidence about what kind of person you are, and the goal is not to be perfect, not to win every vote, but to win enough votes, consistently enough, that the evidence begins to accumulate convincingly in the direction of the person you want to become. What this means in practice is that the place to start is not the hardest thing. It is not the most ambitious transformation, the most dramatic commitment, the most challenging demand you can place on yourself. That approach, the approach of the January resolution, the dramatic overhaul, the all or nothing commitment, tends to fail not because the goal is wrong, but because the foundation is not yet built to support it. A person who has not exercised in years does not become a daily runner by committing to daily running. They become a daily runner by walking first, by showing up for 2 minutes first, by building the identity before they build the habit. Start small. This is not a concession to weakness. It is an acknowledgement of how human psychology actually works. Small victories matter because they change your internal story. When you successfully resist an impulse that you previously always surrendered to, even if it is a small impulse, even if the resistance is brief, even if the victory seems trivial to an outside observer, you have demonstrated something to yourself. You have shown yourself that you are capable of a thing you previously doubted. And that demonstration, however modest, shifts the baseline of your self-concept. You are no longer entirely the person who always surrenders. You are now, at least once, the person who chose differently. And once you are that person, even once, you can choose to be that person again. The psychology of this is well documented. Self-efficacy, the belief in your own capacity to accomplish a specific task, is one of the most powerful predictors of actual achievement. And self-efficacy is not built primarily by thinking positive thoughts about yourself. It is built by mastery experiences, by actually doing things successfully that you previously did not believe you could do. Which means the fastest way to build genuine confidence in your capacity for self-regulation is not to believe in yourself more fiercely. It is to give yourself small, achievable, genuine experiences of success and then build from there. This is why the concept of environment design has become so central to modern behavioral science. If small victories are important, then reducing the friction that stands between you and small victories, and increasing the friction between you and self-defeating behaviors, is a form of strategic intelligence, not weakness. Putting your running shoes by the bed so that the first thing you see in the morning is a gentle cue to move. Putting your phone in another room at mealtimes so that the friction of retrieving it is higher than the friction of being present. Keeping healthy food visible and accessible and placing less healthy options out of immediate sight. These are not grand gestures of discipline. They are the architecture of a life designed to support your intentions. None of this removes the need for genuine effort. There will be moments, many moments, when the environment is perfectly designed and the strategy is clear, and you still have to face the choice and feel the discomfort and make the harder decision in full awareness with no tricks to fall back on. There will be moments when you fail, when the discipline slips, when the old habit reasserts itself, when the best version of yourself loses, temporarily, to the tired and craving version. And in those moments, the most important thing you can do is not to engage in harsh self-criticism, not to interpret the failure as evidence of fundamental inadequacy, but simply to observe what happened with honesty and curiosity, to ask what you can learn from this moment, and then to return to the practice. This is not permission to fail comfortably or to lower your standards. It is an understanding of how genuine growth actually works. It does not work in straight lines. It works in spirals, forward progress, occasional regression, recalibration, renewed forward progress. The person who has never failed at self-mastery has either never truly attempted it or is not being honest about their experience. Failure is part of the path. The question is not whether you will fall, but what you do when you do. The answer always is the same. You get up. You dust yourself off with a minimum of drama, and you return to the practice of becoming who you intend to be. And let us also speak, briefly but honestly, about the role of patience in the architecture of discipline, because one of the subtlest and most corrosive traps in the practice of self-mastery is the expectation of rapid transformation. We live in a world that sells speed, the rapid results program, the 30-day challenge, the total overhaul, the quick fix. And while some changes can happen quickly, a single insight can genuinely shift a perspective. A single choice can set a new direction. The deep work of character change is not fast. It is geological in its pace. It happens in the accumulated weight of thousands of small decisions, most of which feel unremarkable in the moment and only reveal their significance in retrospect. When you look back at who you were a year ago or 5 years ago and recognize, with something between surprise and gratitude, how much ground has been covered. Patience with this process is not passivity. It is an active, deliberate, ongoing practice of trusting that the work is cumulative even when the progress is invisible. It is the gardener's faith that watering the seed each day does something, even on the days when the ground shows nothing. It is the understanding that the most important growth is often underground, in the roots, before any shoot has appeared above the surface. And it is the recognition that you cannot rush this. You can only show up, make the choice, return to the practice, and trust the direction. This patience is, itself, a form of delayed gratification, perhaps the most demanding one, because it requires you to invest sustained effort in a process whose full rewards are not immediately visible, trusting that the investment is real and the returns will come. But they do come, not all at once, not on the schedule you might prefer, but they come. There is also the dimension of social environment, which is easy to underestimate and critically important in practice. The people around you, the social environment in which you are embedded, exert an enormous and largely invisible influence on your behavior. Research on social norms consistently shows that people tend to conform to the behavioral standards of their peer group, often without being consciously aware of doing so. You eat what the people around you eat. You exercise as much as the people around you exercise. You hold yourself to roughly the standards that the people around you hold themselves to. This is not weakness or lack of character. It is the deep social nature of human beings expressing itself. And it means that if you are serious about self-mastery, about raising the standard of your own behavior and becoming more intentional in your choices, the company you keep is not a peripheral consideration. It is a strategic one. Surrounding yourself with people who have the values and habits you aspire to is not elitism. It is the intelligent management of your most powerful social influence. Conversely, spending most of your time in environments where the standard of self-discipline is low, where self-defeating behaviors are normalized and even celebrated, is not a neutral fact of life. It is a headwind against every genuine effort at growth. This does not mean you must abandon anyone who is not perfectly aligned with your aspirations. Human relationships are far too valuable and far too complex for that kind of calculation. But it does mean that deliberately seeking mentors, communities, and companions who model the kind of self-mastery you are trying to develop is one of the wisest investments you can make in your own growth. You will not become more disciplined by reading about discipline alone. You will become more disciplined by spending time in the company of disciplined people, by letting their standard become your reference point, by allowing the social norm of your environment to shift in the direction you want to go. Now let us explore a shift in perspective that may be, in some ways, the most important of this entire journey. It is a shift in how you think about pleasure itself, not just about immediate pleasure versus long-term reward, which we have already examined, but about the nature of fulfillment and what it is that human beings are actually seeking when they seek happiness. Consider the difference between two people. The first person has arranged their life for maximum comfort and minimum discomfort. They avoid challenges, sidestep difficulties, choose entertainment over engagement, and fill their hours with pleasures that are easy and abundant. Their life, in the conventional sense, may contain a great deal of pleasure, and yet, if you looked at this person honestly, if they looked at themselves honestly, there would likely be something missing, a sense of depth, a sense of meaning, a recognition, often arriving in quiet moments, that they have not become what they might have been, that they have not done what they might have done, that the life they are living, however comfortable, is somehow too small for what they actually are. The second person chooses differently. They take on the challenge that frightens them. They make the commitment that demands something from them. They choose growth over comfort, meaning over ease, the long and difficult path over the short and simple one. Their life contains genuine difficulty. There are moments of pain, of failure, of exhaustion. But there is also something that the first person's life does not contain, in the same way a sense of engagement, of authentic participation in one's own existence, of becoming, the ongoing, living, dynamic experience of growing into something larger than you currently are. This is the distinction that researchers in positive psychology have mapped carefully between what they call hedonic pleasure and eudaimonic flourishing. Hedonic pleasure, the immediate, sensory satisfaction of desires, is real and valuable. It is not to be dismissed or avoided. But research consistently shows that when people rank what makes them feel that their lives are going well at the deepest level, the hedonic pleasures tend to rank lower than the eudaimonic ones, the experience of meaning, of growth, of authentic engagement, of contribution, of love and connection, of being genuinely alive to one's own existence. And the interesting and important insight is this: the eudaimonic goods are, by their nature, goods that require some degree of self-mastery to access. They cannot be stumbled upon while following the path of least resistance. They require the willingness to endure discomfort, to delay gratification, to prioritize the deep over the easy, the joy of genuine mastery, of a skill hard-won, of a goal achieved through sustained effort, of a character built through repeated, right choices, is not available to the person who abandons every challenge the moment it becomes difficult. The depth of intimacy that comes from truly knowing and being known by another person is not available to the person who avoids vulnerability in every relationship. The sense of meaning that comes from contributing something real to the world is not available to the person who never risks failure in the attempt. This is, in a sense, the most profound argument for self-mastery, that the things you most deeply desire, not the surface desires, not the reflex cravings, but the genuine longings of your deepest self, are precisely the things that can only be reached by developing the capacity to manage and direct your lesser desires. The discipline is not the price of the prize. The discipline is, itself, part of the prize. There is also the question of what we might call the quality of desire. The texture of wanting itself, one of the quieter joys of developing genuine self-mastery, is that it changes not just your behavior, but your inner life. The person who has never exercised self-control tends to experience desire as urgent, demanding, and often oppressive, a force that insists, that will not be denied, that has a quality of pressure and heat. The person who has developed the habit of pausing, observing, and choosing tends to experience desire differently. The desire is still there, still real, often still compelling. But it does not have the same absolute authority. It does not arrive as a command that must be obeyed. It arrives as information, as a signal that something is calling for attention. And the person who receives it can respond with curiosity rather than compulsion. This is a subtly but genuinely different experience of being human, and it is, in its quiet way, a more spacious and more pleasant one than the experience of constant reactivity, however pleasant the things you are reacting to may be. There is one more dimension of pleasure and success worth exploring here, and it is the dimension of presence. Because one of the paradoxes of desire is that it is inherently future-oriented. It always points toward what is not yet here, what has not yet been obtained, and yet the experience of genuine fulfillment, when it arrives, is always in the present moment. The pleasure of the meal, the joy of the achievement, the warmth of the connection, these are experienced now, in the body, in this moment, not in the wanting, and not in the anticipation, but in the actual, immediate experience of living. And the person who has been trained by a life of constant stimulation and immediate gratification to be always reaching forward, always already half moved toward the next thing, is often unable to be fully present at the very moments that their desires have been driving them toward. They arrive at the goal and immediately begin looking past it. They experience the reward and find themselves already wanting something else. The capacity for full, present, grateful enjoyment, the ability to say, "This is enough, this is real, I am here," is itself a kind of discipline. It is the discipline of arriving, of not always rushing forward, of letting the present moment be complete in itself. To cultivate this capacity, the capacity for genuine presence, is not a retreat from ambition or from the desire for growth. It is the integration of destination and journey, of becoming and being, of reaching and receiving. It is, in some ways, the ultimate fruit of the self-mastery we have been describing throughout this exploration. There is a phrase that appears in many forms across many traditions and disciplines: know the self. The inscription at the ancient oracle of Delphi, the constant refrain of Socratic philosophy, the foundation of every psychological tradition that takes the inner life seriously. And it is, as we have seen, not merely a philosophical aspiration. It is a practical necessity, because you cannot master something you do not understand, and you cannot understand something you have never examined. But knowing yourself is only half of the equation. The other half is this: choosing yourself, choosing consciously, actively, and with full awareness the person you want to be. And then, day after day, in the small moments and the large ones, making choices that bring that person into being. This is what it means to become the author of your own choices. Not to be free from the influence of desire, biology, habit, and environment. That freedom is not available to any human being and should not be desired. We are embedded creatures, shaped by forces we did not choose and cannot fully control. But within that embeddedness, there is a space, sometimes narrow, sometimes wide, always real, in which genuine choice is available. And the practice of self-mastery is, at its heart, the practice of locating that space, inhabiting it fully, and enlarging it over time through the repeated exercise of intentional decision-making. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to found the school of therapy he called logotherapy, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He wrote this from the most extreme possible experience of constraint, a context in which external freedom had been stripped away almost entirely, and yet his insight holds the space between stimulus and response, however small, is where the self lives. It is where freedom is born, and it is where everything that makes you genuinely you, your values, your character, your choices, is perpetually being created. What does it mean, in practice, to inhabit that space? It means developing the habit of the pause. Not a long, deliberate, paralytic pause before every small decision. That would make life exhausting and ridiculous. But the capacity for a genuine, if brief, moment of reflection before the decisions that matter. The capacity to ask, is this actually what I want? Or is this what I have been conditioned to want? Does this align with who I am trying to become? Am I choosing this from my values or from my habits, from my considered self or from my reactive self? This is not always comfortable. There is a reason why so many people prefer not to examine their choices too closely. Because close examination can reveal uncomfortable gaps between stated values and actual behavior, between the person we claim to be and the person our choices reveal us to be. But that discomfort is not a reason to avoid the examination. It is, in fact, precisely the point of the examination. The gap between who you are and who you intend to be is not a source of shame. It is a source of direction. It tells you exactly where the work needs to happen. The concept of personal responsibility, real responsibility, not the punitive, blame, heavy version, but the empowering, ownership-taking version, is inseparable from the project of self-mastery, because personal responsibility is not about blaming yourself for everything. It is about recognizing that, regardless of what has happened to you, regardless of the circumstances you were born into, or the experiences that have shaped you, the choices available to you in this moment are yours. not entirely free, not unconstrained, not equal to the choices available to someone in a different circumstance. But yours. Yours to make with whatever resources you have, in the direction of whoever you most deeply wish to become. This is both humbling and exhilarating. Humbling because it removes the comfort of victimhood, the retreat into the story that your circumstances are simply too powerful, that the forces arrayed against your growth are simply too formidable, that the changes you want to make are simply not available to you. Exhilarating because it opens the door to genuine agency, the recognition that you are not just a character in a story, being written by forces outside yourself, but an author, imperfect and limited, and working within real constraints, but an author nonetheless. The author does not control every circumstance. They do not choose the setting, and they do not always choose the obstacles that arise. But they choose how the character responds. They choose the values that guide the character through difficulty. They choose what the character ultimately becomes. There is a practice that is both ancient and well supported by modern research, and it is the practice of what philosophers call the examined life. Not the life of constant self-analysis, not the life of anxious introspection, that is a trap, but the life of regular, gentle, honest reflection. The practice of sitting with yourself at the end of each day or each week and asking, did I live today in accordance with my values? Where did I choose well? Where did I give in to something that I did not truly want to give in to? What was the pattern? What does it tell me about where the work needs to happen? What this reflection reveals, over time, is not a catalogue of failures. It is something far more interesting and far more generative, a map of yourself, a gradually sharpening picture of your actual patterns. Not the patterns you imagine you have, not the patterns you would like to believe you have, but the patterns that your honest, consistent, non-judgmental observation reveals to be real. And this map is invaluable, because you cannot navigate terrain you cannot see. You cannot change patterns you have not yet recognized. The examined life is, in a very practical sense, the only life that can genuinely improve. Because it is the only life that has access to the information needed to improve. It is a navigation check. It is the gentle, consistent process of comparing your intended direction with your actual direction and making the small corrections that keep you on course. The sailor who checks their compass regularly does not arrive dramatically off course. The sailor who never checks, who assumes that because they set off in the right direction, they must still be heading there, can find themselves, after a long enough time, somewhere entirely different from where they intended to go. One of the quieter gifts of this reflective practice is the development of what might be called self-knowledge with compassion, an understanding of yourself that is honest without being harsh, clear-eyed without being unkind. Most people oscillate between two unhelpful extremes, either harsh self-criticism, which is demotivating and often counterproductive, or self-protective avoidance of honest appraisal, which leaves the patterns unchanged. The middle path, seeing clearly, receiving what is seen with kindness, and using it as direction rather than condemnation, is narrow at first and requires practice to walk steadily. But it becomes, over time, the most reliable ground there is. It becomes the practice from which all genuine, durable change flows. There is also the practice of future self-reflection, which research suggests is one of the most powerful tools available for improving present decision-making. Close your eyes. or simply hold the thought in your attention. And imagine the person you are 5 years from now, if the choices you are making today continue in their current direction. Not the best possible version of yourself, not a fantasy, but an honest projection. If you continue choosing the comfortable over the challenging, the immediate over the meaningful, the reactive over the intentional, where does that person arrive? What does their life look like? How do they feel about the choices that led them there? Now imagine the same 5 years, but with a different orientation. Imagine 5 years of small, consistent choices made in alignment with your values. 5 years of building the habits and the character that reflect who you genuinely want to be. That person is not perfect. They have still made mistakes and had failures. But there is a quality to their life, a direction, a coherence, a sense that they are living in accordance with something that genuinely matters to them, that the first version lacks. How does that person feel? What is it like to inhabit that life? The vividness of this future, self-visualization, the emotional reality of it, is what gives it its power. The more real the future self feels, the more weight the brain gives to its interests in present decision-making. You are, in effect, making the future as immediate as the present, bridging the temporal gap that ordinary thinking leaves unbridged. And when the future is present, the choice becomes clearer. Because you are not choosing between what you want now and what you might want someday. You are choosing between two versions of yourself. Two people who are both you, in different moments of the same continuous life. And only you can decide which of those people you most fully wish to become. There is another story I want to tell you. This one begins where the last one left us, with Marcus, in his small apartment, beginning to understand himself more clearly. But this story is about a different quality of change. Not the dramatic transformation of a single turning point, but the slow, sustained, quiet revolution of someone who has learned to see themselves honestly and to choose, consistently, with intention. About 6 months after that midnight article, Marcus had begun to notice something different in himself. Not a transformation. He would have been suspicious of anything he would have called a transformation. More of a recalibration. A slight but genuine shift in the center of gravity of his daily life. He had not become a different person. He was still the same person who sometimes lay in bed too long, who still occasionally surrendered an evening to mindless television, who still felt the pull of distraction when difficult work was waiting. But something had changed in his relationship to these tendencies. They were no longer invisible forces that moved him without his awareness. They were patterns he could see, feelings he could observe, choices that felt genuinely like choices, genuinely like moments where he stood at a fork and selected a direction, rather than simply finding himself without quite knowing how, already walking down one path or another. He had begun a practice that he would have found embarrassing to describe to most of his friends, but that had proved surprisingly significant. Each evening, for about 5 minutes, he sat quietly and asked himself 3 questions. What did I choose today that I am glad I chose? What did I choose today that I wish I had chosen differently? And what is one thing I can do tomorrow more intentionally? Not a self-improvement regime. Not a performance review. Just an honest, low-pressure inventory of the day. What surprised him was how much he noticed. Not profound revelations mostly, small things. He noticed that he was most likely to abandon productive work around 3 in the afternoon, when his energy was low and his mood tended to dip. He had been, without realizing it, scheduling the most demanding work for those hours, and then feeling defeated when he couldn't sustain it. He moved the hard work to the mornings. The effect was immediate and significant. He noticed that he ate poorly on evenings, after social interactions that had felt draining, as though the social effort had depleted something that food tried to replenish. He began to build in brief, quiet recovery time after demanding social events, and the evening eating improved. Small observations, real adjustments, genuine change. He began to feel something that he recognized, after a while, as the thing he had always been searching for, without knowing it: agency, not control. He was clear-eyed enough by now to know that true control, in the total and absolute sense, was neither available nor desirable, but genuine agency. The felt sense of being an active participant in his own life, rather than a passenger observing the scenery of a journey he had not quite chosen. His relationship with his phone, the thing that had most struck him that first morning he practiced the pause, had genuinely changed, not eliminated. He still used it, still found it useful, and sometimes genuinely enjoyable. But the compulsive quality, the reflexive reach for it, in every moment of unoccupied time, had faded. He now sometimes noticed the impulse to reach for it, paused, and found that he didn't actually want to. He just wanted something, relief from boredom, a moment of ease. And the phone had simply been the default route to that. Having identified the actual need, he could often meet it differently. A brief walk, a few minutes of stretching, sometimes just sitting quietly with the boredom and finding, to his recurring surprise, that boredom, left unscaped, often opened into something more interesting: the fitness habit. The one that had started and stopped a dozen times, had finally found its footing, not because Marcus had finally mustered sufficient willpower, but because he had stopped trying to do it through willpower at all. He had joined a morning running group that met 3 days a week. He had made social commitments that felt harder to break than the private promises to himself that he had been breaking for years. He had found, in the group, a kind of low-key accountability and community that made showing up feel natural rather than heroic. His identity had shifted, incrementally, from someone who is trying to exercise to someone who goes to the running group on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. The effort was still real. The discomfort of early mornings was still real. But the question of whether to go had become, over time, less fraught. It was simply what he did. He had not finished the Python course, but he had returned to it, had worked through 2 more modules, and had accepted that his pace would be his pace. That the goal was not to be the kind of person who burned through online courses in 2 weeks, but to be the kind of person who continued, who kept returning, who valued the learning enough to stay with it, even imperfectly. He was, by any external measure, still an ordinary person with an ordinary life, but from the inside, it felt remarkably different. It felt, and this was the word that kept returning to him, intentional. Like he was, for the first time, genuinely living his own life instead of being lived by it. And what he had gained, what all the practice of pausing and observing and choosing had built in him, was a kind of quietness at his center. Not the quietness of indifference, not the quietness of numbness, but the quietness of someone who knows where they stand and what they care about, someone whose life has a direction that belongs to them. He could still be moved. He could still be tempted, frustrated, joyful, afraid. He was still human, fully and completely. But the emotional weather moved through him, now rather than carrying him off. He was the landscape, not the storm. That is what he had found. Not perfection, not transcendence. Something simpler and more durable than both of those. He had found himself. We have traveled a great distance together. We began with the invisible force, desire, and we have explored its biology, its psychology, its philosophy, and its practical management. We have seen that desire is not the enemy, but the medium through which life is experienced, and through which growth becomes possible. We have seen that the struggle with impulse is not a personal failing, but a universal human condition, shared across every culture and every era. We have seen that the tools for navigating this condition, awareness, emotional regulation, the cultivation of discipline through small victories, the clarification of values, the practice of intentional choice, are real, learnable, and deeply, genuinely effective. Now, at the end of this journey, I want to offer you not a final lesson, but a final perspective. A way of holding everything we have discussed that can, if you carry it with you, orient your life in the direction of genuine freedom. I want to speak briefly about the long game, because everything we have discussed, the habits, the practices, the strategies, the philosophical orientations, is most powerful not when applied urgently in a single transformative burst, but when applied steadily, patiently, over years. Self-mastery is not a project with a completion date. It is a practice with a direction. And the direction, sustained over time, produces something that no short-term effort ever could: a character. A self that is genuinely yours, genuinely stable, genuinely capable of the life you want to live. There will be seasons in this practice that feel alive and progressive, where the discipline comes relatively easily and the growth feels real and visible. And there will be seasons that feel dry and difficult and unclear, where you seem to be gaining no ground, where the old habits pull with the same force they always did, where the best version of yourself seems very far away. Both seasons are part of the practice. The seasons of difficulty are not evidence that the practice is failing. They are evidence that the practice is real, that it is engaging genuine territory, not a simulation of growth but the actual, demanding, irreplaceable work of becoming. What carries you through the difficult seasons is not willpower. Willpower will fail. What carries you through is commitment to something larger than the moment. The values, the identity, the vision of who you are becoming that you have built in the more expansive seasons of your practice. This is why the work of values clarification, the work of identity construction, the work of future self-imagination are not merely psychological techniques. They are the load-bearing walls of the self you are building. They are what stands when the storms come. Marcus understood this, eventually, not in a moment of dramatic insight, but in the accumulation of ordinary days in which he chose, imperfectly, but genuinely, in the direction of who he wanted to be. And what he discovered, what every person who has genuinely committed to this practice discovers, is that the goal of self-mastery is not to become someone other than yourself. It is to become, more fully and more deliberately, who you already most deeply are. The discipline is not a cage that confines your authentic self. It is a structure that allows your authentic self to emerge, to speak more clearly, to act more consistently, to be present in your own life, rather than perpetually distracted from it. Think of two different kinds of strength. The first kind of strength is the kind that the world most readily celebrates: the strength to overcome external obstacles, to achieve visible success, to wield power and influence in the world. This kind of strength has its own genuine dignity and its own real value. But it is also a strength that is, in some fundamental sense, dependent on circumstances. The person whose strength is entirely measured by external achievement is always at the mercy of external conditions. When the conditions change, and they always change, the person whose only strength is outward is revealed to have no anchor within. History is full of such figures, people who commanded armies and boardrooms and public admiration, who seemed from the outside to possess everything that could be desired, and who were privately, profoundly unable to command themselves, who were driven by appetites they could not name and anxieties they could not face, whose external power was, in some ways, a compensation for internal disorder. We do not need to judge these figures. Their struggle was, and is universally human, but their example is instructive, because what they lacked, what all the external power in the world could not provide, was the one kind of power that is genuinely self-sustaining. The power of a person at peace with themselves. The power of someone who does not need the next victory, the next validation, the next hit of recognition, because they are already, in the quiet and ordinary moments of their daily life, genuinely at home in themselves. The second kind of strength is quieter and, in the deepest sense, more powerful. It is the strength of the person who knows their own mind, who knows what they value, what they stand for, what they refuse to become, and who makes choices every day that reflect that knowledge. This is the person who can resist the temporary pleasure that conflicts with the permanent purpose, who can hold discomfort without immediately fleeing it, who can feel the pull of 1,000 stimulations and desires and still, in the midst of all of it, choose deliberately, intentionally, from the still center of their own values. This is not the person without feeling. It is not the person without desire. It is the person who has learned to be larger than their feelings, who has learned to experience desire as information rather than as command. This is the person who is, in the truest sense, free. The strongest person is not the one who controls others. It is the one who can control themselves. Because every external victory is conditional, dependent on the cooperation of the world. But the internal victory, the moment you choose your values over your impulses, your future self over your present craving, your integrity over your convenience, that victory belongs to you entirely. It cannot be taken away. It cannot be contingent on circumstances. It is yours. Every desire obeyed without awareness strengthens a habit, and every habit, unexamined, becomes the quiet architecture of a life you may not have consciously chosen. But every desire understood, held with curiosity, examined with honesty, responded to with intention, strengthens something else. It strengthens freedom. Not the freedom of absence, not the freedom of being unconstrained, but the freedom of self-authorship. The freedom of the person who looks at their choices and recognizes themselves in them. The freedom of the person who has become, gradually and imperfectly but genuinely, the person they most deeply wished to be. There is a quality to this kind of life that is difficult to describe from the outside, but unmistakable from within. It is not the absence of struggle. Struggle will remain. Life, in its richness and its difficulty, will continue to present every manner of challenge, temptation, loss, and confusion. But there is a quality of groundedness, of self-possession, of what the ancient Stoics might have called dignitas, a kind of gravity that comes from knowing who you are and acting accordingly, that makes even the hardest moments navigable in a way they were not before. This is not a destination you arrive at. It is a direction you choose and keep choosing every single day. In the ordinary moments of ordinary life, it is the choice to pause when the impulse rises, the choice to ask what you truly value in the moment of temptation, the choice to build your days around what genuinely matters rather than what is merely immediately appealing. The choice, again and again, to be the author of your own story rather than simply a character who follows whatever the nearest impulse suggests. None of this is easy. All of it is possible. And all of it, every moment of genuine, intentional, values-based choice, moves you closer to the life you most deeply want to live. The more you master yourself, the less the world can control you. Not because the world becomes less powerful, but because you become more. Because the person who knows their own mind cannot easily be redirected by manipulation, by social pressure, by the engineered temptations of a commercial world designed to exploit the unreflective self. The person who has found their center has something to return to when the winds of desire and circumstance push them off course. They have, in themselves, a compass. This is where true power begins, not in the domination of others, not in the accumulation of external symbols of success, but in the quiet, profound, daily practice of choosing, of being the kind of person who responds rather than reacts, who lives rather than drifts, who, at the end of a day or a decade or a life, can look at what they have chosen and find in it the unmistakable shape of who they truly were. That is what this journey has been about. Not perfection. Freedom. Not the absence of desire.